welcome to the NATDEF podcast show. Today we're here with Professors Mariya Omelicheva and Professor Natalie Becker of the National War College. It's a pleasure to have you both, and we look forward to the conversation today on humanitarian aid in the context of great power competition. Why don't we go ahead and get started with introductions, and starting with you, Mariya, if you can kind of walk us through your background and how you got to your current role.
Yeah, sure. So I'm a professor of strategy at National War College here at National Defense University. I'm a political scientist by training with concentration in international relations. And most of my research has been focused on various aspects of foreign policy and foreign policy decision making on a range of security issues. So I have conducted research funded by the Department of Defense. I taught at Fort Leavenworth, CJC, when I was a faculty at the University of Kansas, and that was sort of an inroad to become a professor here at National War College, where I teach strategy.
Okay, and Natalie, if you can introduce yourself.
Sure. I'm also faculty at the War College with Mariya over here, and I'm associate professor, and I've been here this week coming on my third year. I was a civilian academic. I have a PhD from University of California, Irvine, had to throw that in there, in planning, policy, and design, so it was an interdisciplinary degree. So primarily I would characterize myself as a sociologist and anthropologist, but in that interdisciplinary space. Most of my research is focused on how we reestablish a sense of social order in times of crisis and disruption. And then I've also studied COVID-19 because my prior life I was involved in public health. And so I've done some of that work. I studied conflict as well. Basically anything surrounding chaos and destruction, that's my bag. So.
Yeah, we're going to focus on just that, right, with our conversation, humanitarian aid. So the first part of this discussion, we're going to talk about your research, Mariya, specifically your book on COVID-19, Humanitarianism, Geopolitics, Logistics of Chinese, American, and Russian Assistance, and it's published by Brill this year. If you can start off with just kind of telling us how you came to the book's topic and maybe speak a little bit about the research question or questions.
Yeah, sure. So this book was conceived during long, murky COVID period. And it's hard to believe just 4 years ago or so, we were all in this state of uncertainty about what's to come. It was kind of a dire situation. The world seemed to be upended. We were dealing with the new reality of like mask wearing and isolating, and the schools were closed, NDU was closed, and teaching online and managing family life and kids and so on and so forth. So on the one hand, COVID caused so many changes in our lives, abrupt changes, but as a scholar was trying to adapt to the new reality, I was also struck by some continuities. And one of those continuities involved sort of geopolitics. Geopolitics seemed to be completely impervious to COVID, and at a time when it was obvious that we were dealing with a transnational threat, and that countries had to cooperate and collaborate in sharing best lessons, in researching the vaccine, and so on and so forth. But at the time, we witnessed that two major players in international politics, namely the United States and China, they were kind of at the height, rhetorical and in terms of like the actual foreign policy actions at the height of that geopolitical competition. So I really wanted to understand, why countries compete when they're facing a transnational threat in the form of an infectious disease, in this case COVID-19. But the overarching theme and the question for the book is, why do countries give aid, humanitarian aid, to those in need? And when the resources are scarce, how do they decide which countries deserve this assistance the most? And whether there is a difference between the traditional donors like the United States and Canada and UK, Germany, and emerging donors like China, Russia, but also Brazil and South Africa and others, in terms of what the motives, what motivates them to provide the much needed humanitarian assistance.
Yeah, I can remember, like everyone else, those periods where we're just trying to figure out exactly what's next. Yeah. So I can imagine there's a lot of time there to kind of think about what's happening around the world too. So I'm glad that you came to those questions. So could you maybe talk a little bit about the methodology, some of your choices there, as you're sitting and trying to figure out how to answer this question? There's many different ways to do this. What are some of the choices that you made?
Absolutely. I think so. Methodology should always be secondary to your research question. Research question is the driving force, right? Like music for the dance, so to say. And I have also always positioned myself as both a quantitative and qualitative researcher. I've deployed multi-method research design strategies. But in my case, so I was asking, what motivates states to provide humanitarian assistance? And I thought that the answers that were out there, and the answers were like, it's either need-based or interest-based. I thought that those answers were unsatisfactory. Why? Because I believe that each country imbues different meanings in what is the need, what is the interest. And to get at that logic, at that meaning, you have to deploy qualitative method, like kind of rich investigation into the histories, practices, discourses. And so this is what I did for each country that I explore in my book, the United States, Russia, and China. And then I used that rich historical and contemporary narrative that I studied on the basis of a corpus of textual evidence. And textual evidence is something that captures spoken words, and spoken words oftentimes represent, not always, but sometimes they represent what the top decision makers think, right? So, and I used all that to derive hypotheses that I then tested empirically on an original data set that I collected of all the aid transfers that the United States, Russia, and China deliver to various countries in the world. And I thought that COVID was such a great case to study because we know that China in particular has been very, has been trying to hide or has not been reporting diligently the amount and the types of either development or humanitarian assistance it has been transferring to other countries of the world. But in this case, because it was trying to rebuild its image, and it was also competing with the United States as kind of the major health assistance provider, it made all of those donations publicly available. So we used open source data as a way of collecting information and coding this information, and then of course translating all this information into the numbers. You had to assign the dollar signs to all of those qualitative descriptions. So it's a lot of work, a lot of thinking, but at the basis is, again, here's the question, this is what I want to get at, this is what we know, this is some of the unknowns, and how do I get at the unknowns using the methodologies that are available to me.
And why did you decide to choose U.S., Russia, and China, those countries specifically in your focus?
So it's a combination of, actually this is where the NDU, I think, played a very, very important role in my conception of the research design. So I work at National Defense University, National War College, and there is a lot of focus on great power competition, particularly between the United States and China, which is characterized as a pacing threat to the United States. So, of course, I was very much interested in taking kind of a critical geopolitics perspective on great power competition with the United States and China. And I'm also an expert on Russia, so there's a little bit of kind of that selfish, and it's my comfort area. So I brought Russia in. But there is also a theoretical reason, a practical reason, because we know that China and Russia, they form the united front vis-a-vis the United States, confronting the United States leadership in the global affairs. And even if Russia isn't capable of shaping the global order in its own image, this is something that China wants to do. Russia's effort to bring the United States down, so to say, are also beneficial to China. So I wanted to have this kind of triangle of Russia, China, and the United States in the book.
After you conducted your methodology, what were some key findings that you were able to discover?
Yes, absolutely. So the findings are rather complex, so I'm going to try to summarize them in a few sentences. So what I'm finding is that both China and the United States, and of course Russia, they do give aid out of the consideration of need. But this is not the only motivating force. Of course, they act based on their interest. But what I was interested in is that beneath the need and interest, there are these diverging logics, diverging reasonings, rationales that the governments of these countries use to justify where they are sending those scarce resources. So, for example, for the United States has always placed more faith in democracy and market economies. So obviously it channeled more aid to countries that showed promise in good governance, democracies, allies, and so on and so forth. When it comes to China places much more emphasis on state rather than the individual. State is the key actor. It views economic development as a solution to domestic and global problems. It's also a source of legitimacy for the Communist Party domestically. So what I find with China has channeled its aid to the countries that has been part of its Belt and Road Initiative. It even envisioned this aid as part of the Health Road, and Health Road is under the Belt and Road project, right? But another thing about China is that in China's own kind of ethical ways of thinking about aid, it is in a kind of a win-win for the world and win-win for China, in a sense that if China helps others become more prosperous, more able to deal with disasters, and all the global prosperity is going to trickle back to China and benefit China domestically. But prosperity at home is also key source to global prosperity. So China kind of justifies and rationalizes aid in terms of like this win-win. And then, like for Russia, it's all about its identity as a great power state, and a great power state identity has responsibilities, therefore we provide aid, but it also has the rights. Russia is entitled to act in certain ways and use aid as a tool of its great power competition.
And what about for the U.S.?
Yeah, so for the United States, as I mentioned, the United States is, in another thing that I explore in the book is how kind of the rhetoric and the practice, they always interact. And if you look at the United States documents and policies, definitely it's committed to humanitarian aid on the principles of universality, neutrality, political neutrality, that everyone who is in need deserves to be assisted. But then in reality, it actually faces, especially in the situation of complex emergency, it faces that political and security reality where aid and the bureaucracy too, so aid ended up being channeled to countries where there are already mechanisms for distributing development assistance, where are individuals responsible for aid administrations are in present.
Yeah, to make sure that when the aid is given, then you're able to have that aid reach the destination it's supposed to be.
Yeah, and if I may give a specific example, at the beginning of the pandemic, there was a debate as to whether or not the World Health Organization was favoring China, so much so that the United States government paused its membership and its donations to the World Health Organization. Even though the United States has traditionally relied on multilateral mechanisms for distributing aid, and the World Health Organization has one of the largest infrastructures, global infrastructures for being able to get aid to where it's mostly needed. It is by far much more elaborate than what the United States has. And once it kind of paused its participation, it was very much limited in reaching out the locations that the World Health Organization could have helped the United States to reach. So it had to rely on the pre-existing network of USAID offices and the pre-existing projects that kind of limited. I mean, hands down, the United States was the largest donor of both vaccines and COVID-19 assistance. But again, going back to your question as to what motivates and how those motivations play out in practice because of all of other, either strings attached or the way the bureaucracy is structured. And that clearly was demonstrated in the first couple of years of COVID-19.
Thank you about the divergent state motives, but maybe a little bit, I'd like to shift a little bit to like the negative externalities you mentioned in the book. If you can kind of talk through, elaborate a little bit more on those things to kind of help us understand some of the kind of negative outcomes.
Yeah, and so at National War College, we also teach we use this notion of global order.
Yeah.
The global order is not like a domestic order, so there is no world police, there is no world court, but there is still global order in the sense of some basic rules and principles and institutions that regulate state conduct and make it more predictable. And that order is linked to the underlying power structures. The United States has traditionally had more power, so it has been able to shape some of the major economic institutions, collective security institutions like NATO, and other institutions. And so we oftentimes think about this order as liberal international order, and liberal connotes some of the ideas of multilateralism, like individualism, collective security, rule of law, human rights, democracy, and so on and so forth. But other countries, like China and Russia, they are either to kind of fit in and play by the playbook of this rules-based order, or circumvent it, or challenge it, and maybe come up with something else. So why it's important? Because international humanitarian regime, with its own system of rules and institutions and practices, it is a part and parcel, or it's embedded under the liberal international order. And when China began rising as a global power with this economic weight, it brought a new set of approaches, perspectives to bear on its foreign policy behavior. It has its own unique approach to aid, to development. And even though it brings resources, that behavior and that assistance sometimes is perceived by some as threatening to the established framework of rules and institutions.
Right.
So when you're asking me about those negative externalities, because aid given is happening under the umbrella of the rules, and China and Russia are not playing by those dominant rules of international aid given, they're perceived as the so-called rogue donors. And with that, they're also perceived as threatening to the very foundations of liberal international order that are important for the United States to maintain its leadership in international affairs. And so when the United States responds, it responds not only to crises and disasters, it also looks out and says, where is China sending aid? Where is Russia sending aid? And China looks at the United States like, where is the United States sending aid? So instead of responding to the need, they are responding to what they perceive, threats to their own image, to their own positioning in the international order and in the humanitarian regime. And this is something that violates or undermines the integrity of the humanitarian system that should be based on the principles of neutrality, universality, and so on and so forth. And that's one of the negative externalities when global health politics and geopolitics coalesce.
Right. Well, and then I think that's probably a good point to transition on, because what you're describing is something to think about if you're a strategist in a place of creating strategy or policy solutions. And so if you could maybe talk a little bit through some of your policy prescriptions at this point. I know you talked about maybe thinking about points where the U.S. could cooperate in places where we normally would compete.
And maybe also just to add to that, focusing on the audience for the prescriptions, maybe the IC, the DOD, so different branches perhaps.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it is no brainer that when we face problems that are transnational in nature, we need to have transnational solutions, either in the form of kind of working through multilateral institutions or working through state to state or public and private partnerships that are transnational in nature, that no country, including the United States or a group of countries like United States and some European allies and partners, they are simply unable to successfully deal with those transnational problems. And so COVID again was a great example of it. So I think recognizing that there are fundamental disagreements and incompatibilities in national interests, and there are differences in the approaches, that should not prevent cooperation on less sensitive issues, be that food security, where China has established itself as a very prominent donor, or capitalizing on some of the individual expertise. Again, China has a lot of experience dealing with natural disasters, and it has one of the best in the world search and rescue team. From which we could learn more about how to do search and rescue operations in urban settings. And I'm saying all that is because we've had plenty of historical examples of cooperation between, for example, United States and the Soviet Union. The two countries were able to launch one of the largest and most successful international polio vaccination campaign that was maintained even through some of the most virulent conflicts of 70s and 80s. The United States and China, they have a history of collaboration on sharing epistemological data on viruses, avian virus, Ebola, you name it. So we do have lots of precedents. And again, I feel like that the way we think and the way we conceive of others and international relations, like through the lens of great power competition in kind of this narrow sense, and we forget that it's just a lens. And then that lens starts coloring all kinds of behavior that we become mistrustful of, or we are reticent to engage in any forms of collaboration because we fear that it's going to undermine our standing, or we fear that it's going to be exploited in some capacity against us. But again, if so there will always, the demand for humanitarian aid has been growing. It has been growing every year. It has been compounded by ongoing and new conflicts, war in Ukraine, war in Gaza, climate change and climate change related disasters. So every year there is a call for assistance, and nation states are able to meet maybe 30%, 1/3 of that call for monetary and other forms of aid that is required. So, I mean, there is like just no room to not cooperate. There is no room to be duplicative or work at counter-purpose in that space.
Natalie, I see you nodding your head there. Did you have anything to add to the last portion there of the discussion? I mean, I know that you've done a lot of research on crises, so.
Oh, yeah. So I would agree with what Mariya is saying in terms of how I think, at least in your context, humanitarian aid is given, right, but also used as a way to leverage our position of power within the great power competition, which I think, I always imagine it like we can find a better way of dealing with our adversaries by not just being like, well, we're not going to cooperate with you because you're evil and we do this special othering that happens. I think that's what you sort of found in your book. And I mean, we do this in so many other contexts as well, and I think it would be helpful for us to take a step back and understand that the people or the nations that we're calling our adversaries are actually human too, and we need to learn a better way of cooperating without losing our place in the world, if that's what we're really interested in doing from you.
And then again, and another way to kind of restate what we've just talked about is to think in terms of the levels of analysis. So, so there are transnational problems and disasters, and those needs in aid. They are transnational in nature, but we are coming up with the approaches that are national, nation-state level based. Like so, and when we approach it through the lens of national interests, no, forget about it. No, that's what I miscraved. I had this.
Just getting good.
No, I was getting good.
Continue. Go with it.
Okay. I lost. I was like, I had this great framing, and then it escaped me.
I think what you were going towards were interests, right? And the conflict there when we start talking about the othering, and then the intent to actually do good, which is what we espouse. So, how do we reconcile these two things? And I think that's where you were kind of going towards with this, looking at opportunities to cooperate if the goal is to meet humanitarian need.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's very difficult to reconcile, or at least I think the United States sometimes forgets that what is in the interest of the world may not be the same that what's in its own interest, or what's in the interest of the United States may not be what is in the interest of the rest of the world. And, I think it's important to recognize this tension, because we have a tendency to forget that what's good for us is good for the rest of the world. But it's not the case in some contexts of dealing with humanitarian disasters.
It's also
for
difficult
example.
to understand or maybe perceive what the interest of the world is, because you would have some scholars arguing that every state has its own interests, rightfully so. So what are the interests of the world?
The interests of the world, and if we extend beyond this again, limited way of framing things in a great power competition, because we simply want to hold on to our power. Ultimately, that's what it's about, and we don't want people to do things we don't like. We understand that the world is made of humans, and humans are as much the same as they're vastly different because of the cultures they come from and the different societal lenses and the ways of looking at things. But ultimately, we're all human, and that's where this, often misunderstood term of empathy comes in, which means not sympathizing or having compassion for, although I would argue you need that, but to put yourself in the shoes of the other and understand that they are human too and probably want the same things that you do, even though we engage in that, in terms of like the international sphere and international competition, we engage in that demonization, we engage in that othering, and I think that doesn't allow us to have those two competing ways of viewing the world at the same time, which we can. It's not an either or. We can still consider China an adversary, but at the same time recognize that we can also work together as humans instead of like having this one-dimensional view of how we're supposed to interact with our adversaries. I think that's a detriment that we continue to act in that way.
Yeah, so one takeaway, and building on what we've already discussed here, is that we live in both the material world and the world of ideas. But we oftentimes construe the world of ideas in a material sense. So for example, great power competition, even though, again, it's just a concept, it's a construct, it's a way of simplifying very complex reality, making it amenable to foreign policy. But it's just a lens. It's one possible way of thinking about international relations. But it becomes like a real thing that is very confining and constraining. The same about democracy and human rights. I mean, those are very, very important concepts. They have meaning, but they are concepts. And sometimes those concepts become so narrowly construed that they are confining on our ability to cooperate, to overcome that becomes the obstacles to effective foreign policy making. So that's one thing, that one of the things that my book does is it interrogates those mental images that become the guiding posts in foreign policy of these three countries that I analyzed. And the other takeaway is that there is no universal ethics, not in the sense that there are people who would like to be murdered indiscriminately or tortured. I mean, that's not the point. There are no universal ethics in a sense that those ethical justifications that we use for doing good things or not doing good things, they differ from country to country, from person to person. Again, I can draw an analogy between a state and a person. Some people do assist others don't. But even when we assist, how do we assist? Do we assist in kind, or do we provide some financial assistance? Who do we choose to assist to? Young, old, women, men, white, or people of color, and so on and so forth. So whether consciously or subconsciously, we always make those ethical justifications that are rooted in our upbringing, socialization, our worldviews, and so on and so forth. And I do this for countries. I try to understand how do countries come to define their ethical rationale for aid giving.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing about your book.
So we'll pause there, and we'll take a break, and then our second part we'll get into more of a domestic discussion.